Shall I start, Heston?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, welcome everybody. My name is Nikki Adams. I'm from the English Collective of Prostitutes. And just to say, we are a sex worker collective of women working in all areas of the sex industry, both on the street and in premises. We have a national network, many of whom are with us today, and an international network. And we have sister organizations, one in the US PROStitutes Collective, who you'll hear from later, and Empower in Thailand. The title of this webinar is Sex Workers Access to Justice. And I want to say a few words just about the context, which is that, first of all, violence against sex workers is very high, but violence against women generally is very high. And I think we have to remember that we're discussing this in the context of the fact that 2 to 3 women a week are killed by their partner or former partner, and very few victims get justice, to the extent that people now are speaking about how rape in the UK has effectively been decriminalised. And Women Against Rape will speak more on that later. We're also speaking about access to justice against criminalisation, the criminalisation that comes from the prostitution laws. And women will speak about the impact of those laws and the ways in which they undermine our safety by forcing us to work in isolation and preventing us from coming forward to report violence. This webinar is hosted online because of the pandemic. It's a pandemic, as everyone knows, that has increased massively the destitution and the devastation of people's lives, to the extent that you will have heard that the former homelessness czar, Louise Casey, actually raised the alarm about the levels of destitution that was forcing women, particularly mothers and children, into prostitution to feed themselves and put shoes on their feet. And you'll also have seen, of course, that it's taken a footballer to force the government to feed hungry children. And these issues are not often seen together or put together, but they really must be if we're going to realistically discuss what the problem is and what can be done. The pandemic, of course, came on top of a pandemic of poverty and homelessness that was deliberately inflicted on people by government policies. Prostitution had already been massively increasing, and there was really concrete evidence that that was directly related to policies such as benefit sanctions and universal credit and the austerity cuts, which had particularly targeted women. And that had led to many women, particularly mothers, going into prostitution. And I just want to flag up one other thing as well, is that, you know, we have to remember asylum seekers, people seeking asylum in the UK get £37 a week, and many get nothing at all. And so no wonder there's many people going into selling sex to survive. We'll be speaking about a movement against violence, and we ask people to remember that sex workers are at the forefront of that movement and are often invisible because of criminalisation, which means that you can't be public. The movement against violence is also a movement against trafficking. We're glad that there are many organisations on this webinar who look particularly at the issue of trafficking, because that's an important conversation that we think needs to happen. But that trafficking is part of the violence that we face as sex workers. It's not separate or distinct. And I think that actually will help our understanding. And our experience as a sex workers collective is that more women have saved themselves from trafficking than have been saved by police or other agencies. And that bravery and resourcefulness must be supported and not undermined. And finally, my last point is that we often hear people speak about how prostitution is uniquely exploitative. And we would ask people to remember that many, many women, and this is a very common experience of women in our network, that many women go into sex work to escape violence, including domestic violence, and the exploitation and abuse and low wages, which are rampant in other jobs commonly done by women. So those are the issues I think that we need to bear in mind. I'd like to introduce the speakers. The first two speakers are Maria and then Camilla. They're two women in the ECP network. They can't show their face because of the stigma, discrimination and criminalisation that sex workers face. And that is particularly stark for migrant and trans and women of colour. Maria's going to speak first, and then Camilla is going to read a statement from another woman who sadly could not be with us because she had to pull out at the last minute because of a COVID-related family bereavement. But what she says and what was planning to say is so important that we wanted it to be reflected here. After that, we're very glad that Lynn Brown MP has joined us and will say a few words. She can only stay with us for part of the time, but we're really delighted to welcome her here. Can I say a word on the issue of translation? We have translation into Portuguese and Romanian. We had planned and had tested up and down Spanish translation, but I'm sorry, at the last moment, it just did not work. And so we apologize profusely for that if people have come on expecting Spanish translation. If we manage to sort it out in the course of it, I will get a message and I will tell people. But in the meantime, we're sorry, no Spanish translation. What we will do is we are recording this webinar and we will broadcast it with Spanish translation at a later date. Okay, so over to Maria.
Hello.
Hello, go ahead, Maria.
Hi, I'm Maria. I'm from Romania. I have volunteered as a translator for ECP for over 5 years. I have worked with 50 women working on the street, particularly in the Enfield area, and I was involved in legal challenges against arrest and deportation. I speak today about what I have seen and I learned from that experience. If I have to say why women come to the UK, we come make a better life for ourselves and for our family. Many women I know are from rural area where there are no jobs. We come here to send money back home so that people can survive day to day. Some women have to leave their children with family members while we come here to work, and this is very hard. Some women coming to work now, they are going to work in the sex industry, and that what they have decided, but some are beginning cheating to come, and they think they are coming for a good job, but when they come, they find different things. When you get to the UK, it's very hard, especially if you don't know how to speak English. It's very hard to find a job, or maybe if you can find a job, they don't pay you normally, they pay you less. Women are often the main breadwinner. For some men, it's easy if a woman works for them. With prostitution, there is money coming quickly and double, sometimes triples the money you can make on the another jobs. But it's very hard and it's very dangerous. You can put your whole life in danger for this money. Women take this risk for children and for their family. All women who do this because they need to do it because they need, no because they like it. Some women choose to have one man behind them because they think he might protect them, because they know if he's not legal in London to work, and they do not want to be arrested. This kind of man is only there for money. The danger is that when you go with one customers. Maybe he want his money back, or maybe he even doesn't give you money. Sometimes you can do nothing. Maybe you are inside in a car in a dark area and you have to do what he asks you. Maybe you find one customer who is sick and he can give that to you. This is also very dangerous. But if you need money, you must do it. The police don't give you a chance to feel like you are safe. When women work on the street, they tell you to go home. Women have been arrested so many times and have been told to stay inside of the house from 7 o'clock. All the time that they go and ask for help, the police never give it. After the Brexit, the police are coming into the street even more. I know women who were told by the men they have to pay them if they want to stay there on the street. That lady, she went to the police and they told her to go if she didn't want to be arrested. The police say, why did you come? You've come here to tell us you are a prostitute. You want to be arrested. They didn't care. Her life was in danger. We tried to get reports of violence that taken serious, but police did not want to help. One woman was treated with violence working on the street in Edmonton. The police said that she had to be treated 3 times before they can take the action. Even after she was attacked and when she had the name Facebook account with photos and license plate number of one of the men that attacked her, but the police refused to do anything. She fought the police for months to get them to something, but then she was called back to Romania to deal with family problems, so the men were left free to attack others. One woman was working to pay for someone care for her grandmother. She was interviewed by 9 immigration officers in the back of a van, and they took her photo and printed out the documents and then gave her the deportation ticket. It was only us in the ECP that stopped her deportation. I know women who have violent boyfriends and husbands who take their money. They are really pimps. The police do nothing about that violence and instead say that women who are trying to help others, they are pimps. The police say they are worried about trafficking, but when they come up to you on the street, they don't ask women if they are okay, if they need anything. Never. They were only telling women to go home or they would be arrested, and sometimes actually did arrest you. Women don't want customers to be arrested because they are afraid they will not come and women will not make money. In some place, men are arrested for curb crawling, but I want this law to be taken out because it's not for the woman. The law should be changed. They need to make prostitution legal to make all women safe. If it was legal, then customers will know that if they hit the woman or they take the money, they will go to prison. If it were legal and we had a law, then women will be safer. I want to tell, sorry if I not speak very good English, I have to translate by myself this speak and speak to you.
Thank you, Maria.
Welcome.
You were very clear. That was great. Camilla, can I ask you to speak now?
Right, just give me 1 second, please. Hello to everyone.
Go ahead, Camilla.
Hello.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
All right. Hello, my name is Camila. I am first of reading, the second in this case, what another woman said because she can't be with us. Her name is Natalie, and she says, I'm from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm a transsexual woman, and I have been a sex worker for over 20 years. Thank you to the ECP for inviting me to speak at this meeting. I want to tell people that we come to the UK because we aspire for a better life for ourselves and for our families. We come because we hope for more than just survive. We have dreams of more acceptance for freedom to live our lives. For the money we can make for more security to support our families. With the money I make here, I'm able to care of my mother, to buy her cooker, pay for repairs, to pay some money for rent and bills, to others who are struggling to pay for my hormones, to save some money for myself. Many people depend on me and this money to earn. It is not possible for me at home. It takes much to leave family and friends. And when we come here to find this same intolerance that we try to escape, we have trouble to find work and also the hate towards foreigners. Sorry, my English is not the best as well. This I haven't seen worse every year I come back. The transphobia, it is also worse now. I am taking advantage of in a many ways. They try to change me higher for rent or they are demanding the free sex. The clients, they know you will not report violence, so they third they target you also. And I'm scared always of being taken by the police, of being treated badly, of being sent home before I make the money I need to survive. They have much power to do what they want, and the laws, they are too unable. Sorry, I don't understand this word. This woman turned to prostitution because the money and the conditions in other job is worse than the prostitution. Also, if you are a trans woman, there is not other options for where I come from. For working class women, we are told not to expect better. We are made to work many hours on a low pay that keep her poor, and that is still much explo- exploitation and bad treatment. And then to support and care for our families with pay for this. That is much freedom. It brings me to have more money, to not be dependent on a violent boyfriend or my abusive family. And for the transition, this is price we have to pay to change ourselves, that bad side of prostitution. This in this violence and the laws which criminalize us, there is a woman I know to be forced to come to work in the UK or who will call themselves as a traffic victim. We know that we come to, but the conditions some of us are to end up work in this area, this these are bad. Some of the organizations, they say they are there to help us As a trans woman, sex work, they look at her situation always as exploitation and feel they wouldn't prefer us to live in poverty to get back to our families. Perhaps this is more acceptable exploitation to live in. Perhaps I would be viewed as a trafficking in the UK because of the law. We help ourselves to come. We help with money, with travel, with place to stay. But if this is what trafficking is to me, most of us are both criminalized and so called as a victim. We feel that of the effects very strong in Brazil of the traffic and exploration panic. Much of, much of this it is anti-prostitution and anti-migrating controls. In 2014, with the World Cup as an example, there were many raids on borders where 400 women work in a raid. They arrest over 100 sex workers. Many they reported rapes, robberies, and beating from the police. They were protests after to this, but the police nothing happened to them. I do not understand this talk of criminalizing the clients, and it's not to have an effect on us. I still must work. How I am how am I to eat or to pay for the rent? Is there to be a new job for me, which is enough money to live from and to support my family? To give more power to the police is it is bad for sex workers. It is a lie also that the sex workers are not to be targeted. Many of the sex workers they are evicted or charged for pimps of friends. Mother, they are the loser they children, and this work is seen as abuse, and they are to be locked at us unfit to care for the children. The laws they affect most those of us already at high risk. I do not understand how anything of this law can be seen as a feminist or for protecting women. Sex work can be an important partner to fight ex- explo- uh, exploring, but can only work.
Exploitation. Go ahead, Camilla. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt just because you were struggling over that word. Oops. I hope I didn't lose her. I think we did. Oh, you're on mute, Camilla. See if you can take yourself off mute just to finish. Okay, I'm sorry, that might have been my fault. Oh, because I don't know if you automatically go on mute if I speak. I'm sorry if that's the case. I'm sorry, Camilla, I might come back to you just to finish if that's okay, because we did want to hear about your own particular situation, but I think for the moment we'll go on to Lynn Brown, MP, and I hope she can be, yes, okay, I think that might be you. Go ahead, Lynn.
Mute.
Okay, you're on mute, Lynn. We can't hear you.
I have pressed on mute your time.
That's it. Lovely, brilliant.
Good. Can I say, oh, you can't see me. Do you need to see me? Can you see me?
We'd love to see you if you can. We can't see you at the moment.
I don't know how to make it happen.
Don't worry, then go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Can I just then say hello? I'm really grateful for you inviting me here today. I am sorry that I can only stay half an hour. The truth is, and I always believe in telling the truth, it's my niece's birthday. She's all I have, as in she's the one that my sister and I managed to have between us. My sister says she did all the hard work. I'm not quite sure about that. But it's her birthday today and we haven't been able to see each other. And I had booked her in for a Zoom call at 5:30. And she's doing that before she has other Zoom calls with grandmothers and cousins, etc. So I hope you don't mind that I'm going to disappear. Ben from my office is going to be here for the rest of the time and he's going to be taking notes. I have to say that I know some of the wonderful women from ECP, and I know that they're here tonight. I know Nikki and Selma and Laura and Nina. And all I can say is I really am looking forward to an opportunity for being able to be together again and being able to talk. I am really grateful to the testimonies I've heard already this evening. I think it's really important for politicians like myself to have accounts from women who are in the sex trade and to also to hear about the appalling abuses, the horrific abuses that women are experiencing, those who have no protection from the law, but also those who have been subject to trafficking in their lives or from exploitation. And I think it's really important that we hear real stories from women and they can help us to understand the realities of what is in life or in their life. I know that in Parliament, some really good women have been grappling with the issues of prostitution, about its legalisation for 20 years. I also know that for some of those women, the issue of trafficking and exploitation is one of the reasons why they how can I put this? They're worried about lifting the criminalisation of prostitution because they believe it will place women in a more vulnerable position than a less one. They feel that it would somehow lessen the approach against trafficking that the establishment has. And for those women, and I respect those women, I understand that there's an argument, I understand that they are truly grappling with what is best to do and what is best for those women. And I get that their view is different to mine and different to the women in the ECP, but it isn't a bad view. It isn't born from some kind of Victorian middle class moralist who they are just simply finding new ways to express the same kind of view. They are politicians who do understand just how difficult it is for women to survive in this very unjust, unequal world of ours. And they also understand, I think, how scary it is and how frightening it is and how wrong it is to push that trade underground. There is in Parliament, amongst many of the women, when we talk about this issue, a huge amount of genuine concern about the safety and well-being of women who undertake sex work. But I think there's a lack of understanding that banning various forms of sex work doesn't make the sex trade go away. It doesn't reduce the exploitation that is clearly there and clearly goes on. And I think that also it's about, I don't think there's an understanding that pushing sex work underground can be counterproductive and make it less safe for women than more. So I'm going to be working, I hope, with the ECP over coming months and years to try and encourage a better understanding about what sex work means in the UK, what the current laws mean in the UK, how that impacts upon women at all levels. We've been a bit thrown off course by coronavirus because we had organised to meet and talk over the last months, and that's just not been possible. But I'm hoping that the country's going to be back to normal, almost-ish, probably, by next Easter. And then I'm hoping that I can bring the ECP together with a group of hand-picked parliamentarians. Some of them will have the same views that I do, and others will need to be persuaded. But I want us to start talking about what decriminalisation means, how we can achieve it, what we can do in order to bring it about. I'm not going to pretend to you that this is going to be an easy win or an easy fight. I don't think it will. We might even need to take it in steps and stages. But I am committed to working with you on this to see what I can do and how far I can move this debate, this discussion, and this work. I am massively grateful to those who have spoken so far for the bravery that it takes to talk about this issue. And I just want you to know that I am going to try to walk with you over the next years in order to get real change. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you very much. You raised quite a lot there that I'm sure people would like to comment on, but we do appreciate your kind of encouragement and support. I'm sorry that you'll be leaving us, but I know that the conversation will continue with you, and we'll definitely feed back to you the things that people raise that relate to what you have spoken about. And on the question of steps and stages, I think that is one of the things that we're hoping to kind of look into on this webinar. So we'll definitely be getting back to you about that. I have just an announcement, which is, I'm really sorry, none of the interpretation is working. I can't tell you how many times we tested it and worked it out, and it was all working fine. And then, of course, as it happens so many times, we were defeated at the last minute. So I'm very sorry for that. I see that Camilla is back and is ready to speak again. But Camilla, can I ask you just to wait a minute? I'd like to move on to Luca Stevenson from the International Committee of the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe to speak about the really good and pertinent report that they've just done called Undeserving Victims. Luca.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Nikki. So I'm Luca from the European Sex Worker Network. We are a sex worker-led network of more than 100 organizations in 35 countries, including organizations like the English Collective of Prostitutes in the UK. And over the last 2 years, we've been working on this report with 12 organizations in 10 countries, specifically on migrant sex workers, the violence and exploitation they face, and access to justice, in particular when trying to report to the police. I'll share my screen now. Hopefully this works. Let me know. Hopefully this is working. So we wanted to do when sex workers face high levels of violence in their work. And often this violence is actually used against us to call for further criminalization of the sex industry, in particular the Swedish model. We work with 12 organizations in 10 countries and interviewed around 49, there was 49 interviews, mostly cis women, followed by trans women and some cis male sex workers. The majority were non-EU national, 55%, and 42% were EU nationals. So I won't go into too much details because I only have 5 minutes. So the testimonies were around the incidents of violence, with physical and psychological violence recorded the most, followed by robbery, insult, as well as 20% of cases were classified as labor exploitation, forced labor, or trafficking in human beings. So quote, if you find the report, I'll send you the link. There is many quotes from sex workers there. One sex worker from France said, "I didn't know anyone. I didn't speak French very well enough. I was afraid to call the police because I didn't have papers. It was a very difficult situation with a lot of aggression in the middle of winter. People told me not to call the police because they could arrest me. So when I was attacked, my only chance was to run away. Sometimes someone would defend me." And we see from this report that actually more than a third of the respondents did not report to the police due to fear of arrest or deportation. In the case where sex workers reported, they were often supported by organizations like the English Collective of Prostitutes or other organizations, often led by sex workers. And what we see that often sex workers are not viewed as ideal or deserving victims. We've been analyzing in the report the enabling and disabling factors when wanting to report to the police. What we've seen as enabling factors is the involvement into a sex worker collective or the trust of an NGO, sometimes the trust of a good police officer, that the police is committed to protecting sex workers, the knowledge that the police or others will not reveal the status of sex work. And disabling factors include fear of the consequences of reporting, in particular detention and deportation, fear of the consequences of reporting as a sex worker, fines, prosecution, etc. Fear of being evicted. That was actually a big finding as well. Many sex workers fear being evicted from their home, being made homeless, and more further like the negative consequences. And one sex worker from Ireland simply said, "I was afraid and ashamed of going to the police about the situation because I just don't know if it's okay legally to be an escort." So this criminalisation of sex work also means that sex workers are really afraid of reporting. One of the main findings of the report is around experience with the police. We see that actually 36% had a bad experience with the police and 30% had a good experience. And to be critical of our own report, actually what we mean by good experience is that the police basically did their job. The police took the case and they followed on the case. So by good experience, we mean the police actually did their job. And by bad experience, we mean degrading treatment, psychological violence, insult, threats, actual case of sexual violence and physical violence, as well as confiscation of earnings and assets. And this is simply unacceptable. Sex workers and anyone who reports to the police should not fear any kind of degrading treatment and even worse, sexual violence. One sex worker in the UK said, "As soon as the man left, I called the police. When the police arrived, officers asked questions about how many clients we had. A few days later, I received a letter threatening me with prosecution for brothel keeping. Police have refused to take photographic and other evidence. 5 weeks after the attack, I received a deportation letter on the ground that I was not a genuine visitor to the UK. My deportation order was only stopped after the ECP campaign with me." I'll go briefly through some of the key findings. Of course, that you know that stereotyping, stigma have consequences on sex workers' access to justice. That negative experience with the police also determine if sex workers will report. That sex workers are afraid of being punished under prostitution laws or other laws. We are afraid to be perceived as offenders, deserving penalty by the police and not actual victims. And that criminalization of sex work exacerbates sex workers' vulnerability to violence. Another finding is that the absence of a firewall between immigration enforcement and access to justice compromises the non-discrimination principle for undocumented migrant victims of crime. Very simply, our conclusions are that migrant sex workers face high levels of hate crime and gender-based violence. Evidence from sex worker organizations suggests that many migrant sex workers are unable to report crimes due to stigma and fear of arrest and deportation. And that violence against sex workers continue to be an underexplored issue, or even worse, it's actually instrumentalized ideologically against us in order to push for further criminalization, including the Swedish model. And this trend to abolish prostitution by criminalizing clients of sex workers continue to negatively impact sex workers' trust in authorities and exclude us and our organization from policy making. So I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen. Oh, I think, is it working now? I think I'm back. Or
You're back.
yes. So sorry, I know I always speak very fast because it's a big report. I will send you the link to the report. But one really of the key findings that we know already is that the criminalization of sex work and the criminalization of migration have huge impact on sex workers, migrant sex workers' ability to report any kind of crime. This report is only 50 cases, and actually cases of sex workers who were already in touch with organization. There's a huge number of sex workers that we know are just not in touch with our organization and are completely falling through the crack, and the violence they experience is completely unexplored. And finally, about the Swedish model, I come from France. Many countries now have the Swedish model. In France, the violence against sex workers has simply exploded since the Swedish model. This year alone, actually in the first 6 months of the year, 10 sex workers were murdered under the Swedish model. All sex workers in France and countries with the Swedish model continue to say that violence has increased. They don't have any trust in the police in reporting crimes. And what we see is that authorities, different organizations, including a religious organization, feminist organization, continuing to push for the Swedish model in the idea that it would protect sex workers. We know this is simply not the truth. So we hope that the report is useful for organization. I will put the link in the chat there, and I'm available at the end of the chat webinar to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca. And the report is really great and very useful. Because the interpretation is not working, but in any case, we were planning to do this, the whole webinar will be transcribed and published, and also broadcast with translation into those 3 languages. So we're, again, many apologies for people who joined expecting those interpretation, but we will make sure the information is available at a later date. Okay, so next I would like to ask Nicola Mann from Women Against Rape to speak, please.
Hello, thanks, Nikki. I want to say a little bit about Women Against Rape. We were founded in 1976, so we've got 40 years experience of campaigning for justice, protection, asylum and compensation for all victims of rape and domestic violence. We've supported thousands of women who have been treated absolutely appallingly by the police and other authorities in the justice system, including sex workers. At the moment, we're working with loads of mothers who are victims of domestic violence and face having their children removed from them in the family court. And that's just an unimaginable terror that you know, you could have your kids taken away from you because you're a victim of domestic violence. We've won a lot of legal victories, including getting rape and marriage recognised as a crime, and legal firsts, such as the first successful private prosecution for rape, along with the ECP and legal action for women. We're multiracial, and almost all of us are survivors of abuse or rape or violence. One thing that makes us different is that we don't take funding from the police or the Home Office. So we're completely independent of the state authorities. Those of us we find that are women of colour or who live in poverty, if we have disabilities or mental health problems that are often caused by trauma, if we're sex workers, immigrants or asylum seekers, we have to fight racism and other discrimination on top of the sexism and the neglect from the police and the authorities when it comes to reporting rape. So at the moment in the UK, only 1.4% of reported rape now results in a prosecution. So the conviction rate for rape is even less. You know, for a while it hovered around the 6% mark, which was bad enough. But now the conviction rate for rape is under 1%. So rape has practically been decriminalised in the UK. But at Women Against Rape, we're determined to change that. Maria spoke earlier of some of the things that police have said to sex workers. And we also know that the police have said some of the following to sex workers as well who have reported violence to them. So this gives you an idea of how badly sex workers are treated when they report rape. So the police have said, you're telling me you're a prostitute, I'll have to arrest you. They've said that this is just an occupational hazard of your job. We don't investigate matters if you've intentionally put yourself at risk. You're liable to prosecution or detention or removal from the UK if we carry on this investigation. It wasn't an attack, it was just rough sex. And your job description won't fit into any of the categories on our database. So these are the sort of things that put women off of reporting rape to the police. But what we think is the authorities are the state that we have, that's the only way that we can try and get justice for when we're attacked. So if you want to report rape to the police, you have to know your rights, otherwise you won't be taken seriously. So using our collective experience of what's happened to each of us when we've reported rape or violence, we've written a self-help guide. I'm afraid I don't have a copy of it here, but it's called Justice is Your Right, and it's on our website. And it explains what your rights are in the criminal justice process. So it tells you what the police and other authorities should do when you report rape. And most importantly, what makes it different is it tells you what you can do when things go wrong, because they often do. So I just wanted to give you some examples, but you can find it on our website. So we go through what your rights are. So if you want to report to the police now, you can actually make an online report as well as calling them. A lot of women don't want to report to the police straight away. And if you don't, then you should go to a local sexual assault referral centre. And that's a medical unit, which is usually in a hospital. And they'll give you a medical examination and they'll record your injuries. They'll take samples to see if there's DNA, and they'll keep your clothing. And then if you later decide to go to the police, that vital evidence that there might be has been preserved. The police can't say, sorry, you're too late. If you do have an exam, you'll only be asked if you had sex in the last couple of weeks, and you do not need to answer any questions about your sexual history unless your attacker is someone you've been in a relationship with. The police often ask you for your medical records, and they do this and you don't know what your rights are. You have the right to limit what the police can see, because sometimes any history of depression or mental illness that you have recorded can be used to throw doubt on your evidence. So you can limit what the police see, and you can say you can only have my medical records from the time that I reported to the rape. That is your right, and a lot of women don't know that. If you're worried about reporting for fear of being arrested, you can make a third-party report through an organisation like ours or National Ugly Mugs. So at least there's a record of what happened to you if anybody else reports the same person. We've worked with women who have been prosecuted for a so-called false allegation. There's been a campaign to discredit us by saying that a lot of us lie about being raped. Some of us have been convicted even though the attack did happen. And if the police do turn on you when you report rape or arrest you, you do have the right to make a no-comment interview. And we have given women a lot of advice and suggestions, and we've got cautions and fines withdrawn when they've got the right advice. If you report to the police, you are entitled to take somebody with you. You're entitled to somebody called an independent sexual violence advocate, and they can support you through the process. You can contact local charities for this. They're not always the best, I'm sorry to tell you. But when you know what your rights are and you find out what the advocate is supposed to do, if they're not doing it, then you can say to them, well, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is what I need you to do to help me. If your immigration status is insecure, we can help you get an undertaking from the police so that they won't pass your details onto the Home Office if you're reporting violence. So that's just some examples of your rights. And our guide also has some really crucial, valuable, basic tips on self-help. So again, always taking somebody with you if you meet with the officials. Always put things in writing so you have a record. Try not to speak to people on the phone because they can lie about what's been said. And these little things here can make all the difference in your case. So just one example I wanted to give you of a sex worker that we worked with. She had a violent ex-partner and she asked us for help. The police knew that she had been a sex worker and had mental health problems. So we gave her our guide and we went through with her rights. And initially the police refused to act. And then they only wanted to prosecute the man for harassment, even though he had made racially aggravated threats to kill. So with our help, she was able to force the police to listen to recordings of the threats that he had made, because they hadn't even bothered to listen to them throughout their investigation. Eventually, he was prosecuted and imprisoned for racially aggravated threats. it took an awful long time and a lot of mistakes were made along the way, but she knew her rights and she had an organisation behind her and she won her case. Our guide really is crucial, and many survivors and professionals have told us that it is an invaluable tool because, like I say, it doesn't only explain the procedures, it helps you get the best out of a bad system to win your fight for justice. And we all agree that system is a really bad one, but at the moment it's the only one that we've got, and we are determined to make rape criminalised again, and we are always here to support women, whatever they do, whatever situation they've been in. If they feel that they won't believed, then, you know, if people want to contact us or read our guide or get in touch online, then it really can make all the difference and help you turn your case around.
Thank you, Nicola. Very practical, very helpful. Can I now call on Rachel West? Sorry, can I now call on Rachel West from US Prostitutes Collective, please, to speak?
Hi there, good to see you all. US Prostitutes Collective, us pros, is a multiracial network of sex workers and ex-sex workers. It started as a group of Black women in New York and then grew into us pros, US Prostitutes Collective, in 1982. And we've been organizing for decriminalization, resources, and justice. And I was really glad to hear the other speakers. And likewise in the US, there is rampant violence against sex workers. Under Trump's hateful immigration policies, migrants, especially Black and brown people, have faced a climate of hostility, brutality, threat, and deportation. And like in the UK, as poverty increases here in the US, so have the numbers of women and mothers in particular going into prostitution. Us Pros has been long organizing to stop violence against sex workers. Fear of arrest, like everywhere else, has been a big deterrent in reporting violence. This came up during our California campaign to overturn regulations denying sex workers the right to compensation for rape. We won the right to compensation in 2013. Building on that victory, several sex worker groups met and decided to press for city policies in San Francisco that would guarantee immunity from arrest and prosecution for sex workers reporting violence. We got support from city agencies, as well as LGBTQ, immigrant rights, and other groups. All of us started meeting with the police and the district attorney's office, which is like the UK Crown Prosecution Service, to test the waters in a push to find language for amnesty policies. It took 10 months of meetings to get commitment for a policy from the district attorney's office that they would not prosecute people involved in sex work when they are victims of or witnesses to crimes relating to violence. It's called the Prioritizing Safety for Sex Workers policy. We pressed for and got language that immigration status would not be used against victims or witnesses, and that the DA, the district attorney's office, would not report the person making a report to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The police policy took much longer, more than 3 years. Besides the boorish behavior by the police in the meetings and having to stop the meetings in protest at times, the sticking point was our insistence on specific language to do with violence committed by law enforcement against sex workers. The police did not want this and resisted, and it went back and forth. But we did not back down. We'd get agreement from them, then they would backtrack and rescind it. It often seemed stuck. Then in 2017, a scandal involving about 30 cops participating in the abuse of a young sex worker of color exploded in the media. This had an impact and made it clearer for all to see how police interactions with sex workers are often downright illegal and take advantage of women's vulnerability. Finally, the chief of police conceded to holding the police accountable in their policy. The policy says, quote, any officer misconduct against sex workers, including retaliation, coercion, or coercive intimate acts, is subject to disciplinary and/or criminal action. It was a big win to get amnesty from arrest and prosecution for sex workers in San Francisco. We then pushed for this policy to be California-wide, which was a challenge because the state legislature had not shown itself to be at all friendly to sex workers. But having the San Francisco policies broke ground for us, and in 2019, Senate Bill 233, Improving Sex Workers' Health and Safety, was introduced. In addition to prohibiting the arrest of sex workers engaged in sex work when they come forward to report violence, the bill also proposed prohibiting the police from using condoms as cause to arrest someone for sex work. A number of sex worker groups went to the state capitol and lobbied legislators. We got to them before the opposition did, and some hadn't heard directly from sex workers before. We did action alerts and press releases. A big hurdle to overcome was that we had to get a 2/3 majority in both Assembly and Senate. That's because we were going to be changing the evidence law in the legislation. And we got organizations to support. The bill amazingly passed in both houses, and the governor signed it into law last year. It's a major improvement and reduces barriers to sex workers to report violent crime. We continue to actively campaign for full decriminalization. As people have said, it's the criminalization of sex work that makes us vulnerable to violence in the first place. PROStitutes supports the work of the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders, who have campaigned for decades for justice for the over 200 Black women disappeared or murdered in Los Angeles. Many were sex workers. We also work with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival in the US, in the fight against systemic racism, poverty, environmental destruction, and militarism. We'll all be working to hold the new administration in the US to account on these interlocking injustices. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Very helpful. I think the amnesty from arrest is definitely something we can work on here, and speaks to what Lynn Brown raised about steps towards decriminalisation. Could I, before I call on the other two speakers, can I ask Camilla to come back and just finish what you wanted to say about your own situation, Camilla?
Okay, it's based on my own situation.
Yes, if you can, the bit
Okay.
that you were, I think it would be helpful for people to hear that.
Right. Well, about 1 year ago, I was 1 year and 2 months ago, 3 months ago, something like that. I was detained on the Earls Court. I think it's the name of the detain center I was. And based on my experience with the immigrations in the UK is sometimes we don't even know what's happened with us. I was lucky because my English is not the best, but I can communicate with other people. But when they catch me, I wasn't work. I was just with my friend in her house. And they don't even ask me anything. They just asked me what I'm doing in the country and all this stuff. They took me to a place, and there they gave me lots and lots of papers I couldn't really read clear because the language what I'm trying to say is the way it was written, I was unable to understand, and it was so complicated for me. But in the papers, in the front page was written like, the guy said for me, you have to, he didn't give me any option. He just said for me, you have to sign up the papers. And in the papers, I was reading in another situation with someone else to explain me that in the papers was written, I agreed with the deportation and all this stuff. How could I agree with that if I couldn't read? And I didn't have any option. I just had to sign up. Other reason I would be in trouble with them. And of course, when you are detained in a place, you don't know what's going to happen with you. Of course, you don't have someone to explain for you or even to translate for what's written there. They just give you the pen and the papers and you have to sign up. And there is written, you agree with that. How can I agree with that if I don't want to leave the country? I just have someone to talk to me and to explain for me what was happening with me in the detention center. In the moment they asked for me for my health condition, in this moment they call for someone to do the translation for me. Other reason before that, I didn't have any support, like, this has happened with you. Do you need a translator? Do you know what's happened with you? No, I haven't any help with that. I was basically, in another words, forced to sign up my deportation.
Camilla, how did you stop the deportation?
In this moment, I had actually today, I don't know why they stopped my deportation. I don't really know. They didn't say anything about. They just stopped the deportation. I think it was because I had in this time a court case because I was a victim in a robbery.
Okay.
But they didn't say they stopped the deportation because this or not. I don't know yet why they stopped the deportation, basically. But in the same day with me, when they kept me and I was in the van, they stopped in another place and they called for a girl as a client, and they came to the address and they found another girl. She was Chinese. She didn't speak any word in English, only hi. And in any moment, she didn't know what was happening with her. I was trying to help her in the van, speaking with her. Also, when we arrived in the detention center, I was trying to help her because she didn't speak anything in English. And also, I believe she was forced as well to sign up the deportation, because if she didn't speak any English, how she could read the papers they gave to her? It's kind of impossible for her.
Camilla, thank you. Listen, do you mind if I stop you there? Because I think what you're describing is very common and very important for people to hear, that immigration are so harsh and outrageous. That was one of the reasons that we did our right sheet, against deportation. And it's exactly for that situation where people are they take advantage of the fact that you don't have the language. And
exactly,
so thank you very much for that. It's really important that you speak about it. I'm sorry, the only reason I'm stopping you is just because I'm conscious of the time and I want to leave time for questions at the end.
It's okay.
Thank you. And thank you for reading Natalia's statement as well.
Thank you very much. Okay,
so next I would like to call on Dr. Laura Connelly to speak about her new research, EU-Migrant Sex Work in the UK Post-Referendum.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Laura. I'm an academic and an ally and an activist with the Northern Police Monitoring Project. So that's a Manchester-based organisation, a campaigning group really, that works to build community resistance against police harassment, violence and racism. So I guess I'm here today with those different hats on really. A big thanks to ECP for involving me in this conversation so that I can briefly share some of the key findings from a research project that we've been collaborating on, also with Fez Endelaus, looking at EU-Migrant Sex Work post-referendum. So a bit of context then, and some of you will be very familiar with this. Over recent decades, UK governments have implemented increasingly repressive immigration controls. Stricter conditions of entry have been accompanied by an expanding immigration detention estate, increased use of criminal penalties for so-called immigration offences, and an increasingly hostile environment for people who've migrated to the UK. And the UK is particularly hostile towards migrant sex workers, with the quasi-criminalised and stigmatised nature of sex work sort of exacerbating and compounding the negative effects of migrant status. And of course, the effects of this might be felt greatest by racially minoritised or transgender and non-binary migrant sex workers. So I wanted to just share a few things that migrant sex workers that responded to our survey have raised as some of the key effects of the referendum result and the UK's exit from the EU. Of course, what I'm about to say is it won't be news to the migrant sex workers in the room, but hopefully it'll be of some use in sort of adding to that evidence base from which we can all kind of collectively organise. So the majority of migrant sex worker respondents to the survey said that they've made changes to their working practices since the referendum. So things like where they work, the hours that they work, the types of clients that they accept. So one sex worker said, I've had to say yes to more clients, including clients that I've previously rejected and who are requesting services that I'm not comfortable with. I offer more services than I used to, and I've had to decrease my rates. Migrant sex workers also spoke about increased fear of arrest and deportation since the referendum. So one noted that they'd been first arrested for brothel keeping, and although that charge was subsequently dropped, they were then still threatened with deportation for supposedly not exercising their treaty rights. Another sex worker spoke about being forced to invent a different self-employed job on their application for leave to remain, for fear that sex work wouldn't be seen by the Home Office as legitimate labour. And that fear and arrest of deportation, it has real impacts in terms of mental health, in terms of sex worker safety. One of the sex worker respondents said, I'm now a lot more anxious in general. I avoid working, and even if I can't afford to, and then I end up in desperate situations where I have to take whoever calls. And this in turn creates an environment in which violent clients can act with impunity. As one sex worker explained, punters are more confident to report you to the police and the Home Office. Their threats sound like, I'm going to get you deported unless you give me my money back. So there was this strong belief then that the police could not be relied upon in the event that a sex worker is attacked. As another sex worker put it, I'd be even less willing to go to the police now if I experience violence. Too many migrant sex workers have been threatened with deportation. And as another sex worker respondent explained, this means that sex workers are forced to compromise on their safety by working alone, because arrest could result in deportation. But I suppose despite these challenges, and Nikki's already touched on this, that there is always resistance, and ECP have worked with others to successfully fight deportation cases. And sex workers are importantly finding some ways to document a record of waged labour. So I suppose as this transition period comes to an end, we can, and I think we have to, collectively hold the state to account for the hostility it directs at sex workers generally and migrant sex workers specifically. And as others have touched upon, we must continue to fight together for decriminalisation. In the words of one sex worker, decrim is the model that assures safety. It allows us to work together, be visible, and go to the authorities without fear, which is particularly important for marginalised groups. So I guess my final comment is really that it's more important than ever that wherever we're organising from, be that as sex workers or as allies, we have to find ways to make sure that the state finally listens to sex worker and migrant sex worker voices. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Laura. Can I call on Chiara from Amnesty International UK?
Thanks, Nikki, and thanks everyone for sharing. I guess my remarks are going to be looking at these issues from the perspective of international human rights law. I'm sure people are aware, but Amnesty International approved a policy back in 2016 on the human rights of sex workers, which calls for full decriminalization of sex work, but also really looks at some of the structural causes that speakers have been talking about tonight, about the poverty, the lack of opportunities that lead people to migrate, and how those are all potentially drivers of sex work, and also of the underlying gender inequality in society, which means that women are disproportionately represented amongst sex workers. So from the perspective of human rights, one of the main issues that we see is the conflation, so the confusion and the mixing up between trafficking and sex work in law and or in practice. And through the research that Amnesty has carried out in several countries that have different legislative arrangement when it comes to sex work and trafficking, this is one of the issues that we found where really the rights of sex workers are put at risk. And that generally, when there is strong political support for anti-trafficking measures, this comes without a human rights approach. So just to summarize what this looks like, it means that there is a strong focus on criminal penalties and prosecuting perpetrators rather than looking at advancing the human rights of victims. So speakers have talked about, for example, raids. This is something that we found also in our research, especially in Norway and Argentina, that sex workers face the brunt of heavily militarized police raids in the name of anti-trafficking, and that their rights are put at risk when this happens. Or cases where, for example, in the UK, where we see that victims of trafficking are left destitute and at risk of further victimization because there really isn't like adequate support for them. So this is something that we see in the UK a lot with the national referral mechanism. And it was highlighted also during the pandemic that victims of trafficking have been left completely stranded. The other issue is basically, again, on how these, these policies are narrated and implemented, is this argument about reducing the demand for prostitution and this belief that demand is really what drives people into sex work. And so this is operationalized through the Swedish or Nordic model, where in theory, sex workers are decriminalized and the focus is on criminalizing clients, but actually sex workers are de facto criminalized under the Swedish or Nordic model type policies. And the research that Amnesty carried out in Norway, which is a country that has this kind of legislation, has found that actually violence has increased, and under the sort of the aim of disrupting the market, there was this assumption that policing low-level offenses such as purchasing sex work will succeed in preventing the higher level organized crime through like basically what we can call preventative policing. This means that on the ground, sex workers were penalized, and for example, there is even a legal obligation on hotels and other parts of the hospitality industry to detect and prohibit sex work. There is an obligation on landlords to identify and evict, the people who are renting from them if it's found out that sex work is happening. And that migrant women were particularly targeted for racial stereotyping. So, for example, we found through interviewing sex workers in Norway that carrying condoms was used as evidence. And sex workers, as we've heard tonight, like it's not different. There was a very, very high threshold when it came to reporting violence to the police because of all these issues and this fear of being victimized, re-victimized, detained, or deported. So some of the people that Amnesty spoke to really shared how calling the police was only like the absolute last resort when it was a risk to their life. But I think that one of the main issues is that because of stigma and discrimination and criminalization, sex workers are excluded from, the decision-making processes that affect them. And I think we're seeing these when it comes to demands for better access to justice. So, for example, what other speakers have raised around the firewalls, so separation of data sharing from immigration enforcement, is something that, for example, in the UK over the past year has been discussed a lot when it comes to victims of domestic abuse. But for reasons of stigma, sex workers are always kind of left out of this kind of discussions and not seen as like real, victims of different forms of gender-based violence that should be able to access safety as other victims. So I think this is one of the main issues, the real like exclusion of sex workers from decision-making spaces that affect their lives. And I think I just wanted to share something that is quite technical, but I think it's really important because actually there is a space for sex workers in reclaiming their rights and being able to obtain accountability through international human rights mechanisms. And we've seen increased participation of sex workers in the CEDAW processes. So CEDAW is the main instrument we have in international human rights law to protect women's rights. Basically, sex workers have a role to play in making sure that states implement these obligations. But a concerning development that we have seen is that there is a new recommendation from the CEDAW Committee on trafficking in women and girls in the context of global migration. This was discussed over the past, I would say, 18 months or so, and was very heavily debated. And some of these this kind of exclusion of sex workers has really culminated in this general recommendation being quite problematic and adopting this conflation between sex work and trafficking. And we've seen how much it damages people's lives on the ground. It also has some positives in that it recognizes the structural drivers of poverty and inequality that drive people into basically migrating, even when there are not safe routes that they can access. But it's something that for people who work in policy spaces and are allies to sex workers, we really need to step up our game and find creative ways to hold state accountable and like really be able to dismantle these links between, to dismantle this mixing up of trafficking and sex work, because it is really not, it has no place basically in the human rights like architecture. And this is something that has been, made quite clear by different UN bodies, including special rapporteurs. So it's something that as advocates, we need to really continue pushing for.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you very much, Chiara. That's really helpful that you give us a bit of a brief version of that really crucial report that Amnesty did and explain your policy from a human rights perspective. Very helpful. Okay, I would like to finally, in terms of the panel, call on Laura Watson from the English Collective of Prostitutes to speak about some of the work that we have been doing in this area and what we've learned.
Hi everyone, thank you very much. We've worked with thousands of sex workers reporting violence, and as you've heard, often women are told to go away, basically, go home, or are actually threatened with arrest and deportation. And I'm going to say a bit about what we have learned and the problems that we've encountered. So I'm going to start with the problems. So despite police guidelines that women should be treated as victims, this is not happening in practice, as you've been hearing. And women reporting violence get threatened with arrest and deportation, and some are convicted. So Lorraine Morris in our network was prosecuted after reporting an attack, while her attackers were left free to attack again. And a sex worker in our group, robbed at knife point, faced arrest for brothel keeping for working together with others, and then faced deportation after contacting the police. The Victims Code is not followed and victims don't get help. Trafficking victims are referred to the National Referral Mechanism, but not helped to claim asylum, which is the only way to stay in the UK, so that when your time runs out, you're faced with being deported. And trafficking is being separated from other violence, but it can't be treated as a separate issue. If women can't escape rape, exploitation and abuse, then they can't escape trafficking. The remedies are the same. So fear of arrest, and for migrant sex workers, fear of deportation are really the biggest obstacles to reporting and getting justice. And violent men, as we've heard, take advantage of the legal vulnerability of sex workers and deliberately target them. There's a lot of false information about pop-up brothels, mischaracterization of sex workers as victims, and anti-trafficking laws that are being used to justify raids and arrests of and crackdowns against sex workers, even when there isn't any of those things happening. Cautions and convictions remain on someone's record until they're 100 years old and show up with a criminal records check, preventing women from leaving prostitution. And safety mechanisms that sex workers create themselves are undermined by criminalisation. So, for example, on the street, what women would like to do is have time to check up clients, but that doesn't happen because of the criminalisation. And then if it wasn't criminalised, more women would work inside with others, but at the moment that's illegal. The laws, as been said, are used also in a discriminatory way, with migrant trans women of colour targeted particularly for arrest and deportation. The services that we need to escape violence are not good enough. I've just spent months helping a woman victim of violence who was pushed from agency to agency, assessment after assessment, with no consistent work from any organisation, and she would never have been able to navigate it herself. There are a lot of organisations, but no one provided the resources that she needed. People wouldn't answer the phone, wouldn't get back to us, looked for reasons why she wasn't entitled, treated her like she should be grateful for nothing really. And the only exception to this was the National Ugly Mugs, which helped us get the police involved and implement some protective measures for her. And it really seemed like the organisations were there primarily to manage our expectations and to be a gatekeeper between us and the resources we need, or just refer us to someone else so that they didn't have to deal with it. And it's like all the services have been privatised and there's no accountability whatsoever. In other cases, the worst outcome is that social services get involved and they're focused on blaming the mothers themselves for the violence against them and threaten to take the children away. And if we're speaking about access to justice, then this really has to be addressed, because this is also a big deterrent to women reporting violence. And then, as has been said, with the conviction rate for rape at 1%, we have to change that, because sex workers won't get justice when all other victims are denied it. So we have some proposals for change, which I'm going to go through now. So you heard about the victory of Amnesty from arrest for sex workers reporting violence, which is what we're looking into, how this could be implemented here, and we would welcome your support on that. If people need to depend on the police guidelines that I mentioned, they have to be strengthened. At the very least, raid should only happen when the police can prove that there's force and coercion, because at the moment they can go in under any circumstances. Violence against women and girls strategies must not list prostitution as a form of violence. It characterises sex workers as victims rather than protagonists in our own struggles and lives, and is insulting to sex workers and implies that we don't know the difference between consenting sex and rape. The Nordic model or the Swedish model to criminalise clients is being promoted despite much evidence, some of which you've heard tonight, that it undermines safety for sex workers. And as Nikki said at the beginning, there is a lot of violence against sex workers, as there is women generally. And 2 women a week are killed by their partner or ex-partner, but nobody is proposing that marriage be banned, like they are proposing clients be criminalised. The trafficking laws, policies and initiatives must focus on the criminal acts of force and coercion, threats and actual violence, false imprisonment, and not to be used as a justification for raised arrests and deportations of migrant sex workers in particular. Many people have spoken about the root causes of prostitution, which we have to come together and tackle. As women have said, they aren't working for fun, they're working for the money, and because the other alternatives don't pay enough to earn a living. There are many demands that we have, but just to name a few, we want an end to the 5-week wait for universal credit, an end to the 2-child limit, and many other demands. We support the £10 an hour Bakers Union campaign and other campaigns for higher increased wages and benefits and resources. Many sex workers are mothers, and mothers and children's poverty needs addressing if we're serious about reducing prostitution. We've joined a campaign for a care income, which would put money in women's hands for the work we're already doing and change what we feel able to demand for, starting with refusing all exploitative jobs, including in the sex industry. It's a demand that we can come together, and we hope that this meeting will be a start for us to all do that. And then finally, there are various EU directives which are good in that they actually specify what victims need in terms of support. So for example, legal aid, non-prosecution, non-application of penalties, access to compensation, and etc. We would want to add in money and resources to that. And the fact that it already addresses non-prosecution for other crimes, we would want prostitution added to that. And think that in the UK, this can be done by implementing the Home Affairs Committee decision in 2016 to decriminalise sex workers on the street and working together in premises and expunging criminal records. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Very helpful, giving us a bit of a grounding in terms of what's possible and going forward, as well as the problems that we face getting justice. Before I go to questions, I'd like to call on 2 women MPs to say a few words. Liz Saville-Roberts is on the call and is a Plaid Cymru MP, and it would be great if you could say something now, Liz, and followed by Nadia Whittam, who's the MP for Nottingham. Liz, go ahead.
Lovely. I hope you can hear me. Can hear me now? Yep. Great.
Yes, we can.
It's been really useful. There's been some really fantastic speakers on here today. I was just looking back over them. I mean, to hear the live accounts, the accounts from Maria and from Camilla also talking about Natalia, but particularly about the use of language in being obstructive and in denying people their rights. So I think that was a really powerful point there. I also appreciated Nicola Mann's the practical guidance. Actually, for a parliamentarian, just to have some of that practical knowledge would be really useful. And I noticed a comment by Anna Mazzola about the England and Wales's National Police guidance for sex work guidance. I think that also could be something that could be quite useful to be shared. And of course, I mean, it is an honour to follow on from Lynn Brown, and I'm speaking. I hope for many of us, although it's only I think Plaid and Labour that I've noticed are here today. But I really would hope that we'll be able to operate on a cross-party basis. There are other people in other parties who are supportive, I know that. And the idea of implementing a policy of amnesty for sex workers and reporting violence, I think is something that is so practical, because as soon as you take the step back and look at the result of not enabling that, and you're evidently, it's going against the fundamental rights. You're treating people in different ways as different human beings. I don't want to use his name for a fairly obvious reason, but we are, of course, It's just under a week since a man who murdered 13 women 45 years ago in West Yorkshire and Manchester. And I think that, for me, I was a child for some of that time, a young adult for some of that time. And I can remember the impact, and friends of mine as well from Northwest England talking about how it was the women who were stopped to go out with that. But I think also it's the shocking discussion that we've had in the news over the last week about how the women who were murdered were treated in different ways by the police. And then, of course, we're having the same conversation now about the same experience, how people are dehumanized, where you have the cross-cutting facts of people being immigrants as well as sex workers, and how that's playing out in society now. So, I mean, please, I'll not talk for too long, because give an MP a microphone and they'll carry on indefinitely. But the opportunity to work with other people and to give you a voice in the amplification chamber that is Westminster, I will do everything I can on your behalf. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much. I think we've lost Nadia Whittam, I'm sorry. So before I open to questions, I'm glad you raised about the Yorkshire Ripper. I'm sorry, I will have to use the name just so people know what I'm talking about. Because some of the women in the ECP were around at the time and actually organised a protest with Women Against Rape outside the High Court to protest the official disregard for women's lives. And when we came to comment just recently, it was tragic in many ways that you felt like hardly anything has changed with the violence. Nothing has really changed with the violence. Nothing has changed with the poverty. The poverty is in fact worse in many ways. And also nothing has really changed with the policing. And the only thing that seems to have changed is that they speak differently about sex workers, but the actual reality hasn't changed at all. The one thing that has changed is public opinion. Public opinion has changed. It's less moralistic, less condemning of sex workers, more understanding, especially, in some ways of the younger generation, but there's the establishment has not kept up. So we're very glad to have people from Parliament with us who we feel can be a vehicle, a channel for our voices into the corridors of power. So thank you, Liz. I'm going to open for questions. I mean, some of the questions have been coming in already, and I've begun to gather some of them. I think I'm going to have to actually say what they are, because we don't have a facility to let people kind of contribute live. I have one question here, and I will kind of open it up to people to answer. Maddie asks that some of the women I work with, most who don't have status, immigration status, I assume, have lost accommodation due to accusations of them engaging in sex work. What is the law around landlords and large-scale accommodation providers? Serco, for example, which is the private company that runs many of the asylum and immigration hostels. What is the law about them evicting women for these reasons? And what are people's experience in challenging evictions on these grounds? And thank you to all the speakers, they were really informative. I'm going to take one at a time because it's a bit difficult to kind of collect them together. But I think that, I don't know if Laura could answer that one. Briefly.
I'm afraid not really. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure what the law is.
Sorry.
Okay, that's right. Okay, good. I'm really glad that you said the Laura. Good.
Yes, I can answer that. I'm just trying to get off mute. Sorry. Okay. Well, one of the things is that landlords can choose to have in their tenancy agreements a morality clause, basically, which can say, you're not supposed to be doing anything immoral. I don't know if that's the situation in this case. I don't know exactly why they were evicted, but that is often why sex workers can be evicted from their homes and from workplaces, and that is a challenge as to whether, which we have done, as to whether sex work is immoral or not, obviously, and can be challenged in various ways. We're actually working on an eviction case right now in central London where the women were agreed a COVID rate of rent and then were told that that had ended. The landlord decided that that had ended and that they had to pay the full rent or they were being kicked out. And the landlord came with two kind of heavy guys to literally break down the front door and cut the security cable, CCTV cables, and we literally stopped the eviction when they were literally outside the house because we got some advice, some really good advice from the London Renters Union about the women's rights to be there, even though they didn't have an official tenancy agreement. But now they're being taken to court on the grounds of antisocial behaviour. So we will be fighting that case, on the grounds that it's not antisocial behaviour. And I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the next one, I think, because I think there's, did you say that there's information about that in our rights sheet? I'm sorry, did I miss you say that?
I didn't say that, thank you.
Sorry, there's information about that in our main rights sheet, which is on our the ECP website. It's the Know Your Rights, and it speaks about your rights as a tenant and what the law is in relation to landlords and the rest of it. So that might be helpful to people who want to know more. I have a question which I wondered if Luca could answer, which is, thank you to the organisers and speakers. Is the New Zealand model the preferred view of decriminalisation, or are there newly emerging policy models? And then maybe I can deal with the issue of COVID, because I wanted to say something about that. But Luca, do you mind answering that one?
Sure. So usually sex worker organization like European Network, Global Network, or other organizations point to New Zealand as the best model currently available, in which since 2003, sex workers, clients, and third parties are decriminalized, and sex workers can work without fear of arrest. Sex workers can work together in small brothels or in bigger ones. There has been no increase of violence, sex workers feel safer, etc. There is one big caveat to this model, is that migrant sex workers are still not able to work legally. This was not in the original proposal of the law. It was added after, against the wishes of sex workers, and that's something that the New Zealand PROStitutes Collective is working against to change the law in this regard. So there is still exploitation, sadly, because migrant sex workers not being able to work legally then face more exploitative working conditions. So currently, this is the best model. We have some good news that in Europe, Malta now is considering decriminalizing sex work, which is really great. We've been discussing with members of parliament, ministers of justice in Malta, and they are looking at decriminalization. We don't know yet if it will be fully applied, but it's interesting that they are not actually considering the Swedish model, and it has been rejected because there is so much evidence that it is not working.
Thank you. Oh, am I off mute? Good. Thank you very much, Lucas. Short and sweet. Great. Okay. Natalie Bennett from the Green Party, a member of the House of Lords, has sent a message of support, offering to provide any support, particularly asking parliamentary questions, and that decriminalisation is a long-time Green Party policy, and that we have worked together, both, with Natalie as the ECP, to keep it that way. Thank you, Natalie. Somebody spoke about the guidelines, and I think Liz Saville-Roberts mentioned the guidelines. What those guidelines are, National Police Chief Council guidelines, and they're the ones that Laura from the ECP mentioned that we're demanding be strengthened. The reason we're addressing them is because they are raised frequently by the police as an example of how they actually have guidelines to treat sex workers as victims, but in practice that's not what happens, and that's why we're putting forward a proposal to strengthen them. Then I have a question about trade unions, which I'm just going to throw open, and maybe people can just wave at me when I come back onto the screen. It says, in your experience, what is the position of trade unions and other workers' organisations to sex workers' demand for decriminalisation and safety? That is for any of my panellists to wave at me and answer. I know Luca has probably got something to say. Go on, Luca, start us off.
So briefly, I think there is lots of debate within trade union in the UK and across Europe and globally. Actually, in some countries like Argentina, organization like AMAR, which is the sex worker-led organization, they have joined the trade union and have now like 15,000 sex workers member of a trade union, and have done huge work, in particular against police violence in Argentina and supporting sex workers. In the UK, I think it's been a bit more difficult with the union. There was at one point a branch of the GMB that was working with sex workers. I'm not sure what's happening in Scotland with this at the moment, but it's ongoing debate. I know there are different trade unions that do support sex workers, and we really encourage, if you are a member of a trade union, to push for a motion. There are motions available on decriminalization of sex work, but there is resistance, of course, in the trade union movement.
Laura, do you want to, Laura ECP, would you like to just add to that? Because I know you've been working with various trade unions.
Just to add, as Luca said, that there are various unions that support decriminalisation. So to name some, there's ASLEF, CWU, GMB, UCU, and some others. And we've, with ASLEF, worked together very closely to put a motion to TUC Congress a few years ago, which didn't pass, but we did turn up a lot of ground and meet a lot of grassroots trade unionists who do support decriminalisation in the mix of it. So if you are in a union, then please get in touch, and yeah, we'd be glad to speak to you more about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question which I think starts to address the issue of some of the things that Lynn Brown raised about feminist politicians. The question is, are there similarities between a racist point of view and the way some feminists campaign for criminalisation, in that both these approaches ignore the issues that people are actually facing, such as racism and homophobia, and instead of listening to marginalised people, try to imagine or legislate the problem away? I don't know if Chiara from Amnesty has anything to say on that, or anyone. You're all welcome. Please just wave at me if you'd like to answer it.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. I think that, it is really troubling that sex workers' voices continue to be excluded. And I think that as feminists, like wherever you're sitting, like one of the main things would be that we are able to speak about our own realities. So the fact that sex workers keep being excluded and stigmatized when it comes to women's rights spaces, I think is really unacceptable, and it's something that we all need to push against. I also think that there is a lot of misunderstanding around the impacts of criminalization. So for example, in the because I work on women's rights more broadly, like when we work on access to abortion, for example, it's pretty clear and accepted by everyone that if you criminalize one party of a relationship, which is, for example, the relationship between a woman or a person who needs an abortion and their doctor, that the impact is felt on both sides. But this kind of understanding seems to fail when it comes to the criminalization of sex workers or the criminalization of clients. There is this like, I can't say that word in English, sorry, but like blind belief, like against all evidence, that if you criminalize clients, that magically sex workers are not going to be impacted. When, I mean, speakers tonight, and there's like plenty of evidence from very, very different contexts, that's not the case. So I think that is really important to look at the evidence in the face. And I mean, it's just like the stories and what we've seen with COVID. And also I think is like the sort of like the levels of poverty that push people into sex work is something that we can't be blind on, we can't be like ambivalent about. And I think it's also really important to remember that in 2019, it was found that the welfare system in the form of universal credit actually has been pushing people into sex work, even people that had left sex work, in the past and had to come back because of the welfare system itself. So these are really the drivers and not demand. Of course, there is gender inequality in society, massive amounts of inequality and stereotyping of women and violence against women, but criminalizing sex work is not going to make all of that go away. So I think it's really important that we all have the arguments against these things that are false.
Thank you. I've got Nicola from Women Against Rape and Rachel from US Prostitutes Collective. Nicola, would you like to comment?
Yes, I'll try and be quick. When I started with Women Against Rape, I heard a lot of different sayings which all resonated. One of them was rape like charity begins at home, which is so true, because I think that a lot of the feminist movement has devalued motherhood. And we see this through, you know, child benefit being cut, child limit on tax credits. We see it through mothers facing violence in the family courts. You know, judges have made comments like, you know, this father has a successful career and this woman is a mother who lives on benefits. You know, and we all need to be united in this, because a lot of us are mothers, most of us are carers doing unpaid caring work. Another thing that, another saying that I heard in Women Against Rape as well was, if a man is convicted of rape, he doesn't feel guilty, he just feels unlucky. And that is absolutely true, especially with the conviction rate being so low. But, you know, the thing is, every victory that we win is a victory for the next person. So even if you don't get the justice, the absolute justice you need in your own case, any little thing that you win, one of our volunteers describes it as like passing the baton on to the next person. So you win something small and that can have a big impact for the next person. So it is really important that, you know, we are being undervalued as mothers, as sex workers, as women who are doing most of the unpaid caring work in society. And that really has to be recognised by the feminist movement if we're going to start working together to get the justice that we deserve back.
Hear, hear. Okay, Rachel from US Prostitutes Collective.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the racist, you know, politicians dealing with race and enforcement. And, you know, in the US, they haven't. There's a long history of racist enforcement, and the politicians, you know, starting with the war on drugs, that really heavily was enforced against communities of color and had devastating impact. And, you know, the same is true with the enforcement of the prostitution laws in the US. It's Black women, it's immigrant women, it's women of color who are getting arrested and going to prison. And, you know, I feel like now with the Black Lives Matter movement, there is a shift. You know, there is more focus on what's happening to Black people with enforcement, you know, police brutality and all of it. So I feel like, you know, that there is an opening and people have to start addressing it, because we've been raising it for decades, you know, how enforcement of the laws is racist, of the prostitution laws. But, you know, I think we have more opportunity now to discussion about it.
Yes, good, thank you. We have a question about the Scotland consultation. There is a proposal currently being put forward to criminalise clients, to change the law in Scotland to criminalise clients. And there's a consultation that's going on at the moment with a deadline until the 10th of December. The ScotPEP, the organisation there in Scotland, has got a great tool on their website that helps you submit evidence to that inquiry. And we just encourage everybody to do so, to back sex workers in Scotland who are fighting this dangerous law, and just, you know, as many people as possible, so that they really do hear from sex workers and from people that take seriously the impact of criminalisation on our safety. So please do look that up and do that before the 10th of December. And that information will also be going around afterwards. Okay, so I've done that one. And then, oh yes, do we know the percentage of people claiming universal credit who are sex workers? I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. The inquiry that Chiara mentioned, Chiara from Amnesty International mentioned, we actually gave evidence to that along with some other sex worker organisations. And I do really think it changed the terrain in that it gave a much higher, you know, visibility to the horrendous poverty, destitution really caused by benefit sanctions and other austerity cuts, and the impact that that is having in exactly the way that you described, Chiara. So, and I think it really did shift things a lot, and people started actually discussing poverty in relation to sex work in a way that hadn't been done before. But I don't know the number of people claiming universal credit that are sex workers. All I can tell you is that there's a lot more people claiming universal credit now, and people are finding that it's just absolutely impossible to live on the money. And the problems that Laura outlined, the 5-week wait, the 2-child limit, the kind of bureaucracy that's designed to ensure that you don't get your money rather than facilitate you, the fact that they have a housing allowance that doesn't cover anybody's rent, all those issues are really you know, they show that that benefit is completely inadequate and doesn't meet people's economic needs. And I should just say one thing about that, which is that when we issued, somebody asked about COVID, as soon as we went into lockdown, we did a series of demands on the government for emergency payments for sex workers in crisis, for worker status, and for a moratorium on arrests during the pandemic. And arrests did not stop. They went up, in fact, in some areas. There was hardly any sex workers were able to get any of the government support available, and there were no emergency payments for sex workers in crisis. And that really shows you the government's intention in that they are not only not interested in reducing prostitution, they're actually the biggest pimp, frankly. They are the ones, you know, designing the policies that are forcing women into prostitution. And on the COVID, yes, the MPs that replied to us, thousands of people around the country wrote to their MP with our demands. And in fact, Liz Saville-Roberts and Lynn Brown put forward versions of those demands in Parliament as parliamentary questions. And the answers that we got back from MPs, some of them told us, some Tory MPs just said, look, you can go and claim universal credit. And they're not going to live on £75 a week. You can be sure of that. I know it went up to £90 at some point, but people were still not getting the money that they were entitled to. And so universal credit is really central to our thrust. You know, one of the things that we really do want to address. I have one comment that on the question of police abuse, it's very much in the news at the moment, and I think it's important to raise that. People will have seen the series on BBC One, the Small Axe films that are being done by Steve McQueen. There was one about the Mangrove 9 just recently, and one of the comments is letting us know that there's another film called How the Mangrove 9 Won. It's available through the Global Women's Strike website, and all funds raised go to the Haiti Emergency Relief Fund. So please have a look at that. I think it's important, that connection, because the policing of sex work is always separated from the policing generally. And somehow everything that we know about police, where there's impunity against abuse and even deaths in custody, where people get killed in custody and not one police officer is ever held to account, all that body of knowledge that we know somehow is forgotten when it comes to the policing of sex workers. And we always say it's the same police. So do not behave as if the police are going to be our saviors when you have seen here that they are able to abuse with impunity. And I think that also, I'm sorry to just take the time, but I would really like to answer what Lynn Brown said about the women in Parliament. I am sympathetic to Lynn's position because she is having to deal with other Labour women MPs, you know, day in, day out. And she also has, you know, I trust when she says that she thinks that they're well-intentioned, but our experience is different. Our experience is that certain Labour women MPs and also women who call themselves feminists have taken a position against sex workers, have decided that they know better than us what's good for us, and are pushing for criminalisation despite the evidence that it's going to cause harm and undermine safety. And there are two ways that you can abolish prostitution or reduce prostitution. Their way is to increase police powers against us. And what we're saying is if you want to do something about it, you have to tackle poverty and the hostile immigration environment and those other factors that are actually pushing women into prostitution. So I'm afraid our experience is not quite as amiable, I don't know what the word is, as Lynn's, but also I think that we've seen from the trafficking that we do believe also that there are people within organizations fighting trafficking that do actually want to do something about trafficking and exploitation. But there's been a big push from some of those organizations to press again for the increased criminalization of prostitution and to conflate prostitution with trafficking and to separate sex trafficking from other forms of trafficking. And that just is not acceptable. And so I think those are the issues that we have to face going forward. And we have to face that the common ground that we have is the fact that we should be pressing for money in women's hands, for resources for women and children, against the disparaging of mothers, as Nicola said. And that would be something that we could come together with. And if the feminist movement did come together on that, we could actually, there's a chance that we could actually make some progress. So that's okay. Let me go back to my Q&As. Okay, we did the Swedish. Oh, okay. One of the panelists mentioned trans sex workers, including trans women of color. In practice, do trans sex workers face the same challenges as sex workers in general? I'm sorry that some of the women have left because they might have wanted to speak to that directly. I think that, I don't know if any of my panelists would like to comment on that.
Well, if I can just say, like in ICRSE, many members of our board and in our membership are trans women sex workers, many migrants as well. And we know that globally, the majority of trans people who are murdered are sex workers. I think the figure is like up to like 70% of trans people murdered annually are working in the sex industry. And we know that's because there is high levels of discrimination in education, in housing, in other form of, like Camila, I think, was saying earlier, that's not the name, around access to education and other jobs. We mean that many people from the trans community do work in the sex industry and then face, again, high levels of violence, including police violence. And there's been many cases in France, several trans women have been murdered. There's been one case in particular, Vanessa Campos, who was a woman from Peru, trans woman. She came to France to work and send money back to her mother. And actually, she tried to warn the police several times that there were a gang of people threatening her clients. And when she went to the police and she said, like, I'm worried because these men are getting more and more aggressive, the police laughed at her with racist jokes, transphobic jokes, and there was nothing she could do until one day these people tried to steal the money from the clients because clients are criminalized and also don't have access to the police. And therefore she tried to intervene and she was murdered. And this has been the case like in France and many other countries. We know that trans women, in particular trans women of color in the US, but globally, face really, really high levels of violence. And actually tomorrow is, is a Transgender Day of Remembrance. And there's many events online. I think we can circulate as well. I know that ICRSE is participating. Our convener, Sabrina Sanchez, who's a trans woman from Mexico now living in Spain, is participating. And there's more and more information available. So if you go on TGEU, Transgender Europe website, you will find many reports on this topic as well.
Could I just add that some of the trans women in our organization, one of the reasons that women, often migrant and trans and women of color sex workers aren't able to be visible is because of the abuse that really kind of comes down on your head if you are public in any way. And we've had experience recently where some women did speak about their particular experience, and then women who do call themselves feminists actually investigated her and scrutinized her, found her photo from her work profile, and then posted that with her statement online with really horrific kind of abuse. And I think that in this climate of kind of growing transphobia in the UK, it's really horrific what's happening to people online and in person. And it's something that we just all have to absolutely stand against. And it tragically means that you don't, you know, for women who are migrant women, for trans women and for women of color sex workers, you see it's more difficult to be visible, which means that we are all deprived of seeing who sex workers are. Mothers are the other group of sex workers who find it more hard to be visible. I have another one. It says, in societies where pornography has been legal for 20 to 40 years, is it criminally hypocritical to maintain the criminalisation of prostitution? Does anybody want to comment on that? No? You can, it's all right, you don't have to. And then
yeah, sorry, I know I speak a lot, but there is
go on, Luca.
There is a huge campaign at the moment to also, I mean, there's always been a push to ban pornography from same people who want to ban prostitution. But currently there is a huge debate to ban websites like Pornhub, which is one of the main websites for people to watch porn. And it's actually quite successful. And it's based on the idea that Pornhub facilitates trafficking. And it's true that there are cases of exploitation and trafficking on this website. But actually shutting down the whole website is always the same issue as like, oh, let's just shut down the whole thing and it's going to make prostitution or pornography disappear. It's actually not true. It's actually mean that people who make a living from pornography will have to work in more exploitative conditions, will be more precarious, etc. So there's lots of discussion about pornography. Like the UK is trying to ban pornography, it didn't work. France is trying as well. So there's lots of debates around this as well.
Yeah, there's a document that we wrote many years ago called Anti-Porn is the Theory, Repression is the Practice. And it, you know, people should really look at that as well in terms of how anti-pornography is used for censorship and repression. Okay, I have a question about, oh, I've run out of time. I'm sorry. There was two other questions and I've completely run out of time. I'm sorry. We will have to stop. Can I just say that all the links, people are asking for various people's contact information, all the contact information, the links to the various reports, any questions that were unanswered will be answered. We will put that on social media. The whole event is being taped and will be broadcast. The translations, the interpretation will be reinstated so that people can also access it who speak other languages, Spanish, Romanian, and Portuguese in particular. And I would just finish by asking people if they want to actually do something, please go to our website. There is a pledge for decriminalisation that you can sign, and the demands that we made for the pandemic of emergency payments and worker status and a moratorium on arrests are still relevant and pertinent, and you can write to your MP and demand action on those. Women still need the money and we need to get the laws off our back. So thank you very much to everybody who participated, and very much thanks to the panelists and to the people in the background from the ECP and also from the Crossroads Women's Centre where we're based, who helped pull this together. Thank you very much and goodbye.